I don't think this is a problem of science illiteracy. It's a problem of cultural identity, because the concern that a lot of conservatives have is that this is going to take a bigger government and some kind of international agreement. It's going to interfere with liberty. So being interested in climate action makes you a liberal and makes it so you can't go home for Thanksgiving dinner. You can't go back to the Republican Party convention and hold your head high. And so what we live to do at republicEn.org is help them to see that all those things are really the other way around. It's not going to take a bigger government. It's going to take a slightly smaller government.
Hello and welcome to the Great Climate Debate Podcast. I'm Jeffrey DeSena. Today is a very special day for me. I had the honor of speaking with the founder and executive director of the organization republicEn.org. That EN, of course, a play on the name of our major conservative political party in the U.S., is their way of saying that they are proud to be conservatives, proud to vote Republican, but also not afraid to talk about climate change and the energy issues that go along with it. And it was a real pleasure to speak with their founder, former Congressman Bob Inglis. Bob Inglis served 12 years in the United States House of Representatives, representing South Carolina's 4th District. I first heard his story from the film Merchants of Doubt, a documentary based on the book by the same name. Congressman Inglis, a Republican in a solidly red district, faced a difficult primary in the 2010 midterms, during which his position on addressing climate change was used against him. The primary ended up featuring 6 candidates, of whom Trey Gowdy, who remains silent on the issue of climate change on his website, was elected in a runoff and joined a wave of Tea Party representatives entering Congress in January 2011. After leaving Congress, Inglis began a full-time career of promoting action on climate change, founding the Energy and Enterprise Institute at George Mason University. E&EI has since changed its name to republicEn, a grassroots community of over 5,000 educators that aims to promote free enterprise solutions to climate change. Inglis has been traveling the country to speak about republicEn and combating the idea that capitalism and sustainability are incompatible. Our conversation is a brief snippet of the message he has been spreading, which is that climate change is not a liberal issue. Indeed, he argues that environmental protection is fundamentally a conservative issue. I got word of the congressman's availability on very short notice, but I was too excited to say no, and I'm sure you're excited to hear more of him and less of me, so I bring you former Congressman Bob Inglis. Congressman Inglis, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Our listeners will have a little bit of background on you, but just to get some context, what's your history with politics, and how did you find yourself in the U.S. House of Representatives?
Well, I ran for Congress in 1992, having never run for office before, and a miracle got elected. Served for 6 years, and then I was out 6 years and came back for another 6. Pertinent to climate change, in that first 6 years, I said climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And as much as I represented probably one of the reddest districts in the reddest state in the nation, that was the end of the inquiry for me. I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for my first 6 years. And I was out 6 years doing commercial real estate law in Greenville, South Carolina. Running again in 2004, my son, the eldest of our 5 children, came to me. He just turned 18, so he's voting for the first time. And he said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." It's the first of a 3-step metamorphosis for me. You know, a lot of sons are trying to grow up to be like their father. I'm trying to grow up to be like my son. You know, he's good looking, he's fun, he's smart, he's all the things I'd like to be. So I'm trying to grow up to be like him. And so he's really important to me. His 4 sisters matter. His mother matters to me. They all had the same opinion. And so that was the first step. Second step in my metamorphosis was going to Antarctica with the science committee and seeing the evidence of the ice core drillings. And then the third step was another science committee trip, Great Barrier Reef, Aussie climate scientist, showing us the glories of the reef, and I could tell that he and I shared a worldview, because I could see that Scott Heron is his name, that Scott was worshiping God in what he was showing me. And so I knew we shared a worldview before any words were spoken. But afterwards we had a chance to talk. And he told me about conservation changes he's making in his life in order to love God and love people. He rides his bike to work. He tries to do it with air conditioning in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place, as long as his wife and 3 daughters will let him, I suppose. Tries to do without the electric dryer. All these things in order to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. It's a 15-page alternative to the 1,500-page Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill. So my bill was a very simple carbon tax that was paired with a reduction in payroll taxes, so there was no growth of government, and with a border adjustment so that it would make it in the interest of our trading partners to do the same thing. So it got me in a little bit of trouble with the Tea Party, along with some other heresies that I'd committed against Tea Party orthodoxy, and so I got tossed out of Congress in a Republican primary in June of 2010, and ever since have been working to persuade fellow conservatives to step up and enter the competition of ideas, to stop shrinking in science denial, but to rise to the occasion and say, we got a solution. Yes, we do. We got a solution. How about you? And the solution that's so readily available to conservatives is this idea of putting all the cost in on all the fuels and eliminating all the subsidies and having the true cost of energy displayed at our gas pumps and at the power meter. And if it is, then we think at republicEn.org that in the liberty of enlightened self-interest, consumers will choose their self-interest and drive innovation toward lower carbon fuels. That's what I've been doing ever since. In republicEn.org now we got 6 folks, 2 in D.C., 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in California. 2 of us live and work from South Carolina. And we facilitate a community of about 6,000 that we hope to grow to 60,000 or 600,000, and persuade conservatives to enter this competition of ideas.
The policy that you just described there sounded like a very conservative approach to tackling climate change. So what happened in the Republican Party? I mean, even as late as 2008, Senator John McCain was talking about climate change in his bid for the presidency. But it seemed like just in a year or two, there was a major shift away from that.
Yeah, and of course, as you say, it is completely consistent with conservative thought. And the thing I love to show conservative audiences is a clip of Milton Friedman, one of the Ronald Reagan's economics advisors and really a father of modern conservatism, University of Chicago economist, talking to Phil Donahue, who is a fairly liberal guy. And Phil says to Dr. Friedman, what do you do about pollution then, Dr. Friedman, if you don't want to regulate it? And Dr. Friedman says, well, you tax it, of course. You tax pollution. And then he goes on to explain that when 2 parties are doing something that affects third parties who have not voluntarily entered into the contract, then the government has to step in and say, wait a minute, the 2 of you can't do something to harm this third party. You've got to be accountable and responsible to that third party. And that's basically the concept of internalizing negative externalities. You know, if I'm Inglis coal-fired electricity, I burn coal, boil water, create steam, turn a generator, and send electrons down the line to my customers. Currently, I'm getting away with what's coming out of my smokestack. I scrub it a little bit, depending on the age of my plant, but small particulates still go up my stack. They end up in the lungs of some of my neighbors. Most of them cough it up and move on. Some of them, though, end up in the hospital. And when they get there, it's not Inglis coal-fired electricity that's paying those hospital bills, as I should, because I'm the one creating the harm. Rather, it's spread about all of society. Medicare recipients get treatment, and Inglis coal-fired electricity doesn't pay. Medicaid recipients get care. I don't pay. And people that are on Blue Cross Blue Shield, maybe that somebody that got admitted to the hospital is on that same insurance company, their claims experience goes up, their premiums go up. Inglis coal-fired electricity should be responsible for all that, but I'm not. So it is a great deal for me. I get away with socializing my soot. It really works great for me. Stinks for my neighbors, stinks for society, stinks for the federal deficit. And, of course, there's also the CO2 that's coming out of my stack. And so I'm causing the climate damages, and I'm just giddy about the fact that I'm not responsible for those. Great deal for me at Inglis coal-fired electricity. Stinks for the whole world. Great deal for me, though. So I'm basically allowed to socialize my cost and privatize my profits. Pretty good deal. The only thing is that it's not consistent with conservatism because, as I say, conservatism would be what Dr. Friedman was talking about, that the government should step in and make me accountable at Inglis coal-fired electricity. Of course, I'm heard to complain, oh, no, terrible idea. If you do that, I'll have to scrub my stack harder. I'll have to sequester that CO2, and, that'll mean adding capital to my plant and spending capital on my plant, and I'm just going to put it in the rate base and charge my customers more. That, so far, is an argument that's winning the day. Consumers are saying, yeah, we don't want to know how much Inglis coal-fired electricity really cost. We want to just be like the 3-year-old you play hide and seek with, who puts her hands over her face or his hands over his face and says, you can't see me, I'm hiding. So right now we're in a spot where we say, oh no, just pretend these costs don't exist. But of course, what we look to do at republicEn.org is help conservatives to say, no, go ahead and force me at Inglis coal-fired electricity to put the full cost on the power meter and at the gas pump. And then see how I do compared to the renewables. Right now, the renewables need all kinds of props to compete against me. But if you make me accountable, they wouldn't need those props anymore.
Do you think that people would be more amenable to bringing those costs to light if there were more understanding of the science of climate change?
I don't think this is a problem of science illiteracy. It's a problem of cultural identity. That's what we struggle with now more than knowing the science, because the concern that a lot of conservatives have is that this is going to take a bigger government and some kind of international agreement, and it's going to interfere with liberty. And so that's what they're concerned about. And so being interested in climate action makes you a liberal and makes it so you can't go home for Thanksgiving dinner, can't go back to the Republican Party convention and hold your head high. And so what we live to do at republicEn.org is help them to see that all those things are really the other way around. It's not going to take a bigger government. It's going to take a slightly smaller government, because if we simply do what Dr. Friedman would say to do, which is tax carbon dioxide, and then pair that with either a dollar-for-dollar reduction in other taxes or a dividend of all of that carbon tax revenue back to the people, there's no growth of government. In fact, there's a slight shrinking of government, because we'd be able to eliminate some Clean Air Act regulations that would become redundant because of this pricing of carbon dioxide. And so it's a smaller government. It's not a bigger government. And if we do the border adjustment right, where we collect the tax on entry from countries that don't have a carbon tax, then it makes it in their interest to collect the tax in their own country so that their goods come through our ports without any adjustment. Otherwise, on entry into the United States, China, for example, would be paying a carbon tax that's remitted to Washington, D.C. If they just collected that at home, it would have been remitted to Beijing, and their goods would have come through our ports with no adjustment. So they would follow our lead. It's a slightly smaller government. It doesn't take an international agreement. It takes bold move by the United States. It doesn't make you a liberal to be for climate action. In fact, it makes you a conservative, somebody who wants to conserve this glorious creation that we've been given, and it makes you a creation steward. It makes you far from a liberal. It makes you quite conservative, actually, and you got good company with people like Milton Friedman.
This podcast medium, especially the title of this podcast, will probably appeal more to those on the political left. How do you think the political left or progressives can better bring conservatives into the conversation about renewable energy, about climate change, instead of making this more of a tribal issue?
Yeah, very important question, because I think that what we all need is grace. I need grace from the environmental left because, for 6 years I was in Congress saying climate change is nonsense. So I need grace from people that knew it was real way back then. And likewise, I think liberals need to realize their own need for grace, that liberals have a way of assuming that it's only conservatives that are scientifically illiterate, particularly on climate change. But progressives have a problem with science themselves on a couple issues. For example, there's some no immunization people on the left, just like there are on the far right. There's some people on the left that really don't trust nuclear power, and it's just an emotion for them. It has nothing to do with the facts of nuclear power. And then there are people on the left who say that we can't have any GMOs, when in fact the scientific position is, of course you want to alter the cassava root, for example, so that people in Africa don't starve to death. Make it so it resists that fungus that's killing it. And so, in other words, the problem of learning from science and the search for truth is not just the right that has a problem there. It's also on the left. And so what we need to do is just acknowledge that and extend each other grace and figure out, okay, you help me find the truth where I'm wrong, and I'll help you find the truth where you're wrong.
And you've mentioned religion a few times, and you've used a lot of religious terminology in your descriptions. How do you think faith has played a role in this conversation, and how do you think that the faith communities can play a role in moving forward?
It's very important that we involve people of faith in this and speak to people with a faith tradition from that tradition. And so, as a Christian, I believe it's incumbent upon me to be a steward of the creation. And I believe that God is sovereign. He's in control of all things. I believe there's not an errant molecule in the universe. It's also true that he calls on us to be responsible. Now, you can't reconcile those two things. You can't reconcile the concept of God's sovereignty with human responsibility. You just have to hold those two things in tension. And so, the example I like to give is if I'm Inglis Industries and I'm polluting the stream that's killing your cattle, I could say, if I were completely focused on God's sovereignty, that, inshallah, if God wills it, he could clean up my effluent so it doesn't kill your cattle. But I think people of faith, and I really can't imagine any faith where they wouldn't have the same reaction, they would recoil at that thought. No, Inglis, you can't say that. What you have to do is you got to be responsible, man. Clean up your effluent. Don't let it go in the creek where it's killing Jeff's cattle. That's not right. And so you've got to be responsible, Inglis. You can't just count on God's sovereignty. Because the way God usually doesn't act that way. He doesn't usually say to us, if I step off the roof in faith that maybe he's going to suspend the laws of gravity. He says, no, I'm not going to suspend the laws of gravity. You're going down. You dumb, why'd you step off the roof? I mean, it's like, haven't I taught you through life? Don't step off the roof. There's some laws that apply. And so we got to be responsible, but we also trust that God is sovereign.
And I know that you've had your own personal difficulties with this conversation, this debate, and people pushing back against transitioning to renewable energy. And I'm sure you speak with a lot of people who are very difficult to bring around to your side. What keeps you motivated? What gives you hope that this can be a successful endeavor and that we will successfully adapt to the challenge that we're facing?
Well, when I get discouraged, I go watch the 17 minutes of pure American exceptionalism. They're in President Kennedy's speech at Rice University, September 6, 1962. It's a moonshot speech. You can Google it. Just check. Just ask Google for JFK Rice or JFK moonshot speech, and you'll find this amazing 17 minutes where President Kennedy admits that some of the materials needed for the spacecraft hadn't been invented yet. No matter, we're going to the moon before the decade is out. And he admits in his speech that some of what he's talking about is faith and vision. But somehow he was able to rally the American people to that challenge. And he said, we're not doing this because it's easy. We're doing it precisely because it's hard and because it will test our abilities. And so it's just an amazing speech. I mean, as a Republican, I got to tell you, I don't think there's any Republican who's ever expressed American exceptionalism as well. And it's interesting that it takes JFK to show us, a Democrat to show us American exceptionalism. It's an amazing speech, 17 minutes of pure inspiration. So that's where I go when I get discouraged. And I'm also aware that we're making progress. Things are different than they were when I was tossed out of Congress. I got tossed out in June of 2010 in the midst of the Great Recession, the darkest days of the Great Recession. And it's quite different now in three ways, really. One, the economy is much better. Second, we've all had more experiences with climate change than we had back in 2009. Now that it's 2018, we've had experiences with wildfires and smoke. We've had experiences with Hurricane Harvey dropping 40% more moisture than it would have, and Hurricane Florence 50% more. We've had experience with bark beetle. We've had more and more experiences with drought and different weather patterns. And so experience is teaching us that climate change is real. And the third difference is there are now more organizations ready to support members of Congress as they venture on this path towards solutions. When I introduced my bill in 2009, there was no Citizens Climate Lobby. There was no republicEn.org, no Alliance for Market Solutions, no Clear Path Foundation, no Niskanen Center, no R Street Institute, no Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. I could go on. None of those, no Climate Leadership Council, none of those organizations existed. And so now, if a member of Congress, especially a Republican, steps out on this, there's support on the growing ecoRight, as we call it, as a balance to the environmental left. And in order for us to succeed, we really need to grow that right wing, cause America to come together and lead the world to a solution here.
Well, thank you for all of your work, and I know your time is short today, but I will certainly provide links to our listeners for all the things that we talked about. And I wish you the best of luck in continuing to build bridges and continue this conversation and providing an alternative solution to a lot of what we've heard about a major challenge that we all face. So thank you very much for your time, sir.
Great to be with you. See ya.
If you enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or wherever you prefer to get your podcasts. And please share with your friends on social media or maybe in a real live conversation. If you'd like to know more about Bob Inglis and the ecoRight, the best place to start is at republicEn.org. This has been the Great Climate Debate Podcast. I'm Jeffrey DeSena. Thank you for listening.